living in Honolulu, we often look across the Pacific to Portland because you guys have a mass transit system that we lust after. We don't seem to have the political will to pull that together. We've been talking about mass transit for, I think it's about a quarter century now. And still talking about it. It's coming, they say, but I'll believe it when I start to see the concrete going down. I was asked to speak, as Sylvia mentioned, about Asian studies and why Asian studies now. And I realize this is an evening event, and we're kicking off for a workshop tomorrow, so I thought maybe instead of starting in really hard and heavy, I'd start with a story. The story is an old one, actually. It comes from the Lotus Sutra, which is one of the most widely read Buddhist texts in East Asia. And I think it's an interesting text in some ways because it's a really nice illustration of early globalization processes. The text was probably composed around the beginning of the Common Era, so roughly 2,000 years ago in India, written originally in Sanskrit. It came into China across the Silk Roads that by the 2nd century were already linking up Europe and the Middle East with China. Eventually they get as far as Korea and then the islands of Japan. The text first came in probably around the 2nd or 3rd century, and by the 4th century the kind of quintessential translation of it took place. It was done by a Central Asian monk who was born with a mother who was Indian by birth, a Turkish father. He immigrated into China for the purpose of spreading the Dharma in China. His translation became central to a couple of different traditions that grew up, particular traditions of Buddhism in China. By the 8th century, China was a country or empire of more than 50 million people, so roughly about the size of contemporary France. When this translation of the Lotus Sutra was being done, the capital of China, Chang'an, was a city of 1 million people. This is in the 8th century. 1 million people within the walls of the city, and then I asked about the population of Portland, another 1 million people outside the walls of Chang'an itself, so a capital of 2 million people, so think of San Francisco and Oakland combined. And this is in the 8th century. So the story is a parable, actually. It's about a father. Rather well-to-do merchant who comes home one day and finds the lower story of his home in flames. He walks in the gate of the house and his servants are frantic to come and tell him that, we've gotten out almost everything we could of value from the home. Unfortunately, your 3 children are stuck on the 2nd floor. We've got a net. It's below the balcony by their rooms. We've called for them to come out, and they simply don't seem to hear us. So the father rushes to the balcony, yells up to his children, and he can hear them playing. He can hear their laughter, and they're kind of talking with one another as children do. And they stop long enough to hear him. And he says, you've got to come out now. The house is burning. There's flames throughout the 1st floor. You've got to come to the balcony and jump. Silence, and then they say, we're having too much fun, Dad. No. And they go back to playing. Laughter and running around and so on and so forth. And at first he tries commanding them, he orders them to come to the balcony, he pleads with them to come to the balcony, and then finally another strategy strikes him. And he yells up to them that he'd gone shopping on the way home. And while he was shopping, he bought each of them a gift. And to his oldest son, he says, I brought you something really nice. His son loved everything that's mechanical. So he says, I brought you an intricately carved wagon with wheels, with multiple spokes, and so on and so forth. Really, really nice out of hardwood. Silence. For you, my daughter, I brought, who loved everything that had to do with animals and plants and so on, a new kitten. I brought you a kitten. For his youngest son, who loved sports and so on, a bow and arrow. So the children run to the balcony. They say, give us our gifts, give us our gifts. And he says, no, first you have to jump down into the net. The children jump and they're saved. So it's obviously a parable about skillful means, this Buddhist concept of upaya, that if you want to help people to author their own liberation, sometimes you've got to use skillful methods, not always the most direct methods. So let me use some skillful means in talking about why Asian studies and why Asian studies now. We all, of course, know about the population of Asia. 60% of the world population, that's 3.5 billion people, live in Asia. Of the 10 largest countries in the world, 6 of those are in Asia. That's China, India, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Japan. So 6 out of the 10 most populous. One thing most of you might not be aware of is the fact that 50%, 1/2 of the world's Muslim population lives in Asia. Of the largest Muslim populations nationally in the world, the 4 largest national groupings of Muslims, where? In the Middle East? Africa? No, in Asia. Indonesia, 200 million Muslims. Pakistan and India tied at about 154 million Muslims. Bangladesh, 127 million Muslims. So if you look just at that kind of a statistic, it's a little surprising. These are big Muslim countries. But in Thailand, in the Philippines, in Malaysia, significant Muslim populations. How many of you think of China as a Muslim country or a country with a significant Muslim population? I see a few heads nodding, but not too many. China's Muslim population, registered Muslim population, and that may not be the same thing as the actual number of practicing Muslims, but the registered Muslim population in China is 39 million people. That's the largest concentration in the Middle East other than Turkey, Egypt, and Iran. Larger than Iraq, larger than Saudi Arabia, larger than any of the other countries. So I mean, when we think of the Muslim world and we don't think of Asia, we're not thinking very accurately. 4 of the top 12 economies in the world are in Asia. I mean, we hear a lot about economic development. Japan is the number 2 economy in the world. China, depending on whose statistics you're using, if it's World Bank, and depending on how they're using, whether it's Gini coefficient or they're doing simple GDP, it's either number 3 or number 4, either just ahead of Germany or just behind Germany. India, number 10, Korea, number 12. We've got income growth or economic growth levels in China and in India. You'll excuse the jet lag. I was afraid the tongue might not work. In India and China that are running 8 to 10% a year, and they've been doing that for a decade now. China now has the distinction of having the largest foreign reserves in the world. They just passed $1 trillion this fall. $1 trillion of foreign reserves, $700 billion worth of U.S. bonds and securities, government bonds and securities. And that's a concern. It's a concern because it's political leverage. That might seem abstract, the idea of foreign reserve. But in China today, think that 50%, 1/2 of all the concrete being poured in the world is being poured in China. 1/2 of all the concrete. If you go to Beijing, the last time that I was in Beijing was 1.5 years ago, and they talk about the cranes of Beijing, and they're not talking about birds that are flying in from Central Asia. They're talking about construction cranes. Anywhere on the ring road, they've just built the 6th ring road. You travel on the 6th ring road, it's about a 20-mile diameter of a freeway system. Anywhere on that ring road, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, you see construction cranes operating from anywhere on that road. And it's not just 1 or 2, it's dozens from any point on that ring road. The growth in China is just phenomenal. Along with that, you'd expect some problems. 4 out of the top 10 emitters of fluorocarbons, greenhouse gases, are also in Asia. Japan and Korea, Japan and India, relatively modest, 5% each. Korea, 2%. China, 19% of the global total. Roughly 1/5 of all of the greenhouse gases coming out of China. It's not by accident that China is an engine of the global trade, of global economy. They're burning the coal, the oil, and so on. The manufacturing that's going on there is in part a reflection of that, this pollution level. Of the 15 most polluted cities in the world, 11 of those are in China. The pollution, and Emily A. will speak to you about that in some degree on Saturday, the amount of building, of construction, of manufacturing going on in Asia is just utterly phenomenal. It's a region that's on steroids. We talk about steroids in sports. Asia is on steroids when it comes to economic growth, to development. That can be worrying, but are the Asians sitting back and saying, well, it's just the way things are going, we're not going to worry about it? They're concerned, and they're doing everything they can, especially in terms of education, to generate the kind of capacity that they need, whether it's in the sciences and engineering, but also in terms of shaping public policy to be able to respond to these kinds of issues. Higher education in Asia is something that many of us wouldn't necessarily be aware of. If you come in my generation, you went to undergraduate school in the late 60s, early 70s, you're thinking, Okay, Asia, not too many PhD awarding institutions, relatively modest higher ed. Most Asians are going outside of Asia to get their higher education degrees. It's not true any longer. The highest rates of enrollment in higher education in the world are in Asia. Korea's age cohort from 18 to 23, the typical higher education age cohort. That age cohort, 84% of the age cohort is in higher education, enrolled in higher education. 84%. In Japan, it's 70%. Malaysia was lagging behind, and they were thinking, we're down at typical developing country levels of 20 to 25% of the age cohort, and they decided, we're going to put some money into this. And they started investing 10% of the national budget in higher education. In 4 years, 166% growth of enrollment. They're just nudging up over 60% now. They're serious about education. There are countries that haven't gotten quite that far. Take China, for example. China's enrollment rate from that cohort, 18 to 23, is only 21%. 21%, that's 23 million students. So it's a big number, it's a big country, so it's a big number. 1/6 out of every student enrolled in higher education, full-time, part-time, in the world, is enrolled in higher education in China. 1 out of every 6 globally. It's a huge number of people going to school. The enrollment rate in China quadrupled in the last 10-year period. Quadrupled. The building of universities, we talk about building high-rises and freeway systems, university building in China is just going off the Richter scale. They went from something like, on the order of 10 years ago, 1,000 institutions of higher education to 3,500. Tripled their capacity in just a 10-year period. So there's investment in it. For reasons like these, I think it's fair to say that to the degree that we ignore Asia today, to the degree that we're ignorant about Asian cultures, and of the social, economic, and political aspirations of Asian cultures and societies, we're placing ourselves at risk, seriously at risk. With statistics like the ones that I was just giving, many people will say that in our era of global interdependence, globalizing higher education is not just an option, it's a necessity. It's not a question of whether we can do it, whether we should do it, we must do it. There's no question about that. And while I think that that's true, I think that the reasons for it go a lot deeper than the usual ones that are cited. The usual sort of reasoning behind it, the rationale is as well, we have to maintain national competitiveness. If we don't take Asia into account, as a country, we're going to be less and less competitive. And I think that that may be true in some degree, but I don't think it's the largest reason. I don't think that's really the problem facing us. It's not the real deep imperative for why Asian studies and why now. I started off with the Lotus Sutra in part because it's a good story about skillful means, but in part it's also, as I said, because it's a very good illustration of what globalization is about. Globalization isn't anything new. Globalization, is the people who do anthropology and archaeology know, globalization's been around as long as there's been human cultures. The claim could be made that cultures do not rise in isolation, autonomously, that all cultures arise interculturally. That it's through those dynamics, those meetings across otherwise considered to be boundaries between communities, that cultures start to define themselves and start to develop. Globalization is not anything new, but contemporary patterns of globalization are distinctive in a couple of different ways. And while it's a very complex phenomenon, let me mention 3 of those. The first is simply the accelerating and intensifying rates of change. Change, we know how fast things are changing. We can cite those statistics on higher education in China. Tripling capacity in terms of numbers of schools, quadrupling numbers of students enrolled. That is rapid change. Nothing like what the world has seen at any other point in time. Could not have happened without the kind of global forces that are driving Chinese economy into high gear. Couldn't be maintained and sustained without those globalization forces continuing to work at that same level of dynamism in China. So on the one hand, we're looking at accelerating change, but it's also a change in the quality of change. It's not just quantitative, it's qualitative shifts. that we live now in an era of complex interdependence, and those of you who have done some complexity theory know one of the characteristics of complex systems is that they're subject to changing in nonlinear fashions. We've all heard this term emergence. Emergence is a nice way of talking about this nonlinearity. What it means is that you can look at a given system, whether it's higher education as a system, an economy, a market, and in analyzing its dynamics, one of the things that's really clear is that, yes, there's this incremental slow change that can be speeding up along the way, the quantitative changes and things occurring, but then there are these ruptures. The most classic one is probably the breakup of the Soviet Union. You can take any number of people who were doing IR in the 80s and look at their work. Look at the work of the people who are studying the Soviet Union, the specialists on the Soviet Union, and not a single one of them predicted the breakup of the Soviet Union. After it occurred, everybody went, of course, that makes perfect sense. And everybody was upset that they didn't come up with it. And the lesson in that is not that they weren't doing their homework. The lesson is that in complex systems, like national governments, like international economies, like higher education systems, change can occur in ways that could not have been anticipated, but that after the fact will make perfect sense. It's a phenomenon that can be mathematically described. So we're getting much more and more familiar with that in the sciences, the social sciences, and it's now moving into the humanities. We need to take the qualitative dimensions of change into account. The second dimension of globalization that's quite unique is the homogenization forces that are at play as a function of globalization. This is what worried the early theorists and critics of globalization. They were worried about westernization, and they were worried about the McDonaldization of the world. It turns out not to have been as big a worry in those respects as we might have thought. McDonald's is probably everywhere. People like Thomas Friedman talk about there's no countries that have ever gone to war that had McDonald's in them. He's been proven wrong now. We've got wars going on. But there is that phenomenon. There's also the phenomenon not just of westernization, but easternization. You can go through Portland, as I did today, and the number of Asian restaurants, of karaoke bars, and so on. We talk about sushi. Your students are watching anime, Ang Lee movies, Gong Li is a world film star, and so on. There's an easternization process that's going on as well as westernization. But the homogenization phenomena that go along with globalization are very, very real. Everybody in this room has probably got a little piece of plastic that enables you to draw money here, in Jakarta, in Beijing, in Cairo, pretty much anywhere in the world. We know how to do our banking. You need to change money. The processes by which you change money at an airport, an international airport, anywhere in the world have been completely regularized. That is quite phenomenal. That kind of institutional convergence, the scale that it's taking place at, and its penetration into daily life is really something different and distinctive. The pluralizing effects, the Soviet Union's breakup is one example of that, but it's also lifestyle proliferation, the numbers of different student types that you get on campus. In the mid-'60s, when I was in grade school and coming through junior high, there were the surfers and the Ivies. That was basically it. Well, you had some greasers left over from the 50s. Maybe you had 3 or 4 different categories of students. Go to a grade school today and try to do an anthropology, a sociology of the student body. And there's a proliferation of patterns of identification. What some theorists have called distant proximities are arising. James Rosenau, a theorist on international relations, coined this term distant proximities to talk about the phenomenon of people having identities where your strongest sense of identification is not with your neighbors, not with your family members, not with the people you live with, but the people you're blogging all the time. That these kinds of communities, these patterns of affiliation are developing that are quite distinctive and that are largely pluralizing the communities that we're living in. We're familiar in some degree with that. It's also patterns of uneven development. There are those differences opening up as well. In the world today, the top 2% of the global population, the top 2%, that thinnest possible of creams, owns 50% of global wealth. The bottom 50% of the global population, 1% of global wealth. And that income gap is opening. The wealth gap is opening in every society and across societies, and this is also a function of globalization processes. Now, I assume that all this is somewhat familiar, that we've heard statistics like these, we've heard about the globalization, issues of change, homogenization, pluralization. But as a combined result of all these, driven as they are by advances in science and technology, we're not just in an era of change, we're in a change of eras. And the way that I would describe this change is we're moving from an era of problem solution to an era of predicament resolution. Problems occur when our familiar practices for arriving at the ends we intend to pursue no longer work, when something doesn't do the job we hoped it was going to do for us. Solutions take care of that. Hybrid automobiles are a solution to the problem of high fuel costs. They don't address congestion. They don't address issues of the fairness of access to transportation. They solve the problem of high fuel costs. Predicaments are quite different from problems. Predicaments occur when there's some circumstances, some confluence of patterns of relationships and events that make us aware of the presence in that moment, in that situation of conflicting or contrary patterns of values, interests, understandings of development, senses of the meaning of what's good. Global hunger, global climate change, the kinds of economic inequity that I was talking about before, illiteracy that still remains globally quite high and that afflicts women and children, female children, larger than any other population group still globally. Those kinds of problems, illiteracy, hunger, climate change, are not problems. They're predicaments. 800 million people a day do not have enough to eat. That's not because we don't have the science and technology to produce the food. We can produce the food. The reason that those people are not eating what they need every day is because we've got a system of agribusiness that has interests, corporate interests, that are very, very hard to challenge because they're connected with politics, because they're connected with a particular set of cultural sensibilities. Climate change is not a problem, it's a predicament. Everybody wants a good, clean environment. I've traveled throughout Asia, probably 15 countries in Asia, everywhere I go. Do you want a good environment? Everybody wants a good environment. Yeah. Traveled in Europe, have people who've done stuff in Africa, African studies people. When you travel, do you ask about the environment? Yes. Is everybody concerned about the environment? Yes. Does everybody want a good, clean environment? Yes. Where's the problem then? The problem is, how do we define what we mean by a good environment? What do we mean by clean? The United States has one understanding of that. They wouldn't sign, our government wouldn't sign the Kyoto Protocol. Why? Well, because it might not allow us to pursue our national interests in the way that we want to, because we might not be able to undergo the kind of economic growth that we'd like to undergo. And it's not to say that there's anything wrong with pursuing national interests or with pursuing our economic advancement. That is something, again, that every country on the world wants. The difficulty is that it makes us realize that we've got a real predicament to resolve. Predicaments are not solved, they are resolved. Where resolution implies two things. It's greater clarity about the factual circumstances that we're living in. What are the patterns of interdependence that bring about the conditions of 800 million people a day going without the food they need? How does that happen? That's 1/6 of the world's, well, not 1/7 of the world's population. What are the patterns of interdependence that allow that to happen? That's one side of the equation of resolution. We're familiar with that with your digital cameras. What's the resolution? How many pixels do you get? And what's the level of refinement of the picture? To resolve predicaments, you need a very finely grained, highly detailed understanding of the facts of the case. But you also need clear and very clearly shared commitments. It's clarity plus commitments that allow us to resolve predicaments. So in sum, we live in a world where we are being faced with what I would refer to as an aporia of difference. Aporia is an old Greek word. It simply means an impasse. We philosophers like it. An impasse, a paradox. The aporia of difference is this. We live in a point in time in global history when, to a degree that's never before been the case, we need to recognize and respect differences, enabling differences to matter more, not less, than they ever have. The differences between what we have in the US as a quite privileged, well-developed country, and the aspirations across Asia to have something like the lifestyle, the security, the human security in terms of health, in terms of food, in terms of education that we now enjoy. Those differences are important and need to be taken into account. Gender differences. Differences in terms of aspirations, religiously, spiritually, these are important differences and need to be taken into account. At the same time, the reason it's an aporia is because at the very same time that we have to somehow recognize, respect these differences, allow them to enable more, we also need to engage in collective action, global common cause of a scale and scope that we've never imagined before. We cannot address global climate change independently. I mean, we can do individually what we can do, but to really address what's going on with climate change, we need to do things at a global scale. And so we need in some ways to subsume our differences within common causes. Enable differences to matter more, subsume those differences into collective action. That's the aporia. How do we do both at the same time? What role might higher education play in that? On the face of it, it would seem that on the one hand, we know at least two things about the process before us in terms of resolving or passing through, breaking through this aporia. One is that we're going to have to go beyond our typical moral distinctions between the universalist approach to everybody's just like me, and therefore we all have basically the same values and we have basically the same interests, and family means the same thing for everybody, so we're all on a common footing, we all have the same human nature. That, to a lot of people in the world, sounds like ethnocentrism. That's a peculiar, historically and globally peculiar way of thinking. It's distinctive to a particular modern Western tradition that has now become globalized. But that universalist approach that everybody's basically like me is really not something that is doing the work that we need to get done to solve this aporia. But the postmodern relativisms that would hold that the differences that we have run so deep that there's no possibility of critical commensurability. We can't put two different cultures side by side and judge one against the other. And there's no universal standard against which to judge them all. And that spectrum from the universalist to the relativist, from the modern that now seems to be increasingly obsolete, and the postmodern that has its attractions, that entire spectrum of views, those strategies for dealing with difference share one characteristic, and that's let's disarm differences. It's the disarmament of difference. To resolve the kind of aporia that we face in the world today, to be in a position to face and to resolve the kinds of predicaments that we're aware of, we need to go beyond disarming difference. In fact, to conserve and enhance and accentuate difference. What do I mean by that? One part of the picture, I think, is that we need to really start conceptually digging into our concepts, like difference. One way that I've been doing that is to rethink the term diversity. Diversity is all over higher education, not just in the US, all over Europe, all over Asia. Everyone's talking diversity. But the way that the term diversity is most commonly used is as a synonym for variety. It just implies that you have a multiple number of things, people, beings, cultures, whatever the case may be, coexisting at the same time. Someone can come in this room, look around and say, wow, there's a lot of variety in this room. I mean, just by looking at the physical types, the backgrounds, just by looking at faces, physiological characteristics, most people nowadays would say there's a lot of diversity in this room. And I would resist that. Variety is a surface characteristic. You can see it at a glance. You walk in a room, you can see whether there's variety or not. Diversity, I think we should reserve that as a term of achievement. It's a relational quality that's not something given. It's not noticeable at a glance. Whether or not there is diversity in this room, or the degree to which there's diversity in this room, will be a function of how the relationships among all of us play out over time. Diversity is a relational characteristic. The way that I would use the term is diversity refers to that kind of pattern of relationships according to which differences are activated as the basis for mutual contribution to sustainably shared welfare. Differences are activated as the basic condition for mutual contribution to sustainably shared welfare. Very different from variety. Higher education can become a site for understanding the meaning of diversity, but also serving as a conduit for engaging with developing the means to arriving at diversity not just within the institutions of higher education, at the colleges, at the universities, but in our societies more broadly. They can, in fact, become engines for exploring the meaning and means to equity. Equity is often thought about as equality of opportunity. How many people think equality is a great thing? How many people think equality is just a fiction? It's a very good fiction. It is a very good fiction. The fiction of equality enabled the American democratic revolution, having governments that are based on government by the people, for the people. However that plays out in fact, it's an ideal that's been very, very good. The ideal of approaching, at least, redressing gender inequity. We haven't gotten to gender equity yet, certainly not gender equality yet, but the idea of equality is a good thing, but it's a fiction. We need a sensitivity to issues of equity, where equity is not just this equality of opportunity, which will at some level always be a fiction. There are schools in India today where the schools are mandated by the government. The schools are built, the teachers are hired, they're open to boys and girls both. Who shows up at the schools? The boys, because culture holds the girls back. Do those boys that show up, the retention rates in Indian education up through higher education are atrocious. I mean, we're talking about losses of 50% at every one of those steps from primary to secondary to tertiary. So the losses are huge. And those losses aren't because of issues of governmental ideals about equality. They have to do because the value of equity has not really penetrated the society yet. So what would we mean by this notion of equity? Equity occurs when the situational dynamics allow and enable everybody who's present to somehow contribute to furthering their own interests, but in ways that are valued by others. It's that combination of the two. It's not rational choice. I pursue my own self-interest and ultimately somehow the invisible hand steps in, it's going to be good for everybody. No. It's I pursue my own self-interest in a way that is valued by everybody else in the situation that I share. I allow my differences to stand, and I in fact enhance my differences so that I can differ distinctively enough from the others around me to make a difference for them. Educating for diversity means shifting the locus of concern from how we differ from one another to how we might best differ for one another. Differing from one another to how we might best differ for one another. It implies that we're going to somehow go from simply learning about one another, learning about Asian cultures and societies, and to take the extra step to learning from them and learning with them. Learning about to learning from, learning with. Educating for equity means enabling the differences of each to make a difference for all. The paradigm shift from knowing that something is the case. Science is the paragon of this. Engineering is a paragon of this. As currently practiced, but it can change. And that is, I know, like my 5-year-old's always asking me, why are the islands here? Well, because of volcanoes. Where do the volcanoes come from? Because of X, Y, and Z. I can tell them all of that, okay? But if we're going to educate for equity, we need to go beyond knowing that something is the case and knowing how to do things, the engineering component, to knowing whether or not to do something. From knowing that to knowing how, and then finally, ultimately, to knowing to. It's a restoration of a bifurcation, or a recension of a bifurcation that has occurred in education from the early modern period, when wisdom and knowledge were separated. And that's a way of saying, let's heal that wound that exists between knowledge and wisdom, so that we are not just educating young people to know that something is the case, or to know how to do something because the market needs it this year. They may not need it next year, but they need it this year. It's rather to say, let's prepare our students to make the kinds of hard decisions that go along with knowing in a particular case, in a particular context, in the context of very particular relationships, whether doing something in particular is appropriate or not. It's about that particularity of the differences, conserving those differences and making those something that's at the center of what we do in education. Our planetary home, unlike the home in the story of the Lotus Sutra, is not burning yet. It's warming up inexorably. Learning about, in, and from Asian cultures and societies precisely because of their vast differences from those of us who are trained in an American or European tradition. Precisely because of the vast differences in how the notion of the good is understood within Asia, not just between us and Asia, us, code for us people working here in America, and I realize all of us are not Americans. Even those of us who were born here might not really be American. But precisely because of those major differences, the study of learning from, learning with Asia, Asian cultures and societies, affords us with really remarkable resources for trying to understand what do we mean exactly by educating for diversity and educating for equity. A generation that's educated in substantial neglect of the distinct differences among Asian cultures and societies, and that's true also ignorance about the differences within European or Oceanic or American or African societies, same statement would stand, is a generation that's lacking in the capacities, but very also likely the commitments to do anything about the kinds of predicaments that we face in the world today. Although the dynamics of 21st century globalization are generating ever greater and deeper predicaments, they are also generating ever more potent opportunities for realizing global common cause and shared resolve on the proper means to and meaning of human flourishing. I hope that the workshop that's going to take place over the next couple of days, in some small but concrete ways, is able to take into account our differences and in some small way realize a measure of diversity among the group gathered that's going to spend 2 days of their time together, that we can be an example in these 2 days and do something concrete, activating our differences in the kind of way that we would need to if we're going to wisely proceed into the future with the idea of resolving our common predicaments and understanding really what do we mean together globally by human flourishing. Thank you very much.